Three attacks in three countries. Israel is said to have hit targets linked to Iran in Syria, in Lebanon and in Iraq. So why is Benjamin Netanyahu escalating tension with Tehran? Will Iran respond? And if so, how? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Martine Dennis. Welcome to Inside Story. Now, Israel's been blamed for a string of attacks against Iranian-allied forces in three countries over the weekend, and that's raised tensions across the Middle East. Early on Monday, three Israeli airstrikes reportedly hit a base belonging to a Palestinian group in Lebanon in the town of Qusaya, right on the border with Syria. Now, those attacks came a day after two Israeli drones caused damage in the capital Beirut. One of them hit a building which housed the media office of the Iranian-backed Hezbollah in the city's southern suburbs. Another Israeli drone exploded in the air in the same area. Well, Israeli forces also carried out drone attacks in Iraq and in Syria. Israel did not respond to the accusations that its assault killed at least one fighter from Iraq's popular mobilisation forces. But Benjamin Netanyahu says the operation in Damascus, which triggered Syrian anti-aircraft fire, was to prevent a drone attack on Israel by Iran.
If someone rises up to kill you, kill him first. In a complicated operation, we revealed that Iran dispatched a special unit off to Syria to kill Israelis on the Golan Heights with explosive drones. I'd like to emphasize, this was an initiative of Iran, and we prevented serious attacks. We will expose any attempt by Iran to attack us and any Iranian effort to hide behind excuses. We will not tolerate aggressions against Israel from any country in the region. Any country that allows its territory to be used for aggression against Israel will face the consequences, and I repeat, the country will face the consequences.
Well, Israel's actions triggered threats of retaliation from both Iran and Hezbollah. An Iranian government spokesman described the attacks as shameless violations of sovereignty and said there'll be a response. Hezbollah's leader calls them a very dangerous development.
Enough is enough. We will never allow Israeli aircraft to attack Lebanon or a target in Lebanon. Then the Israeli side will never feel safe. The Israeli drones that are coming to Lebanon are not coming here to collect information. They are suicidal drones that aim at killing us. From now on, we will face the Israeli drones when they arrive in Lebanon skies. We will crush them. We will drop them.
Right, time to introduce our guests now. From Tel Aviv, we have Seth Frantzman, who's Middle East analyst for the Jerusalem Post. In Tehran, Mohammad Morandi is an Iranian political analyst and professor at the University of Tehran. In London, Sami Hamdi, editor-in-chief of the National Interest Journal. Welcome to you all. Seth, let me start with you in Tel Aviv. So the frequency of Israeli attacks are increasing. They're widening in scope. Over the weekend, we're now talking about three different countries, multiple axes of conflict. What is Benjamin Netanyahu up to? What's the objective?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to be clear that some of these strikes are alleged, but Israel has taken responsibility for what's happened in Syria. And I think that, obviously, Israel is trying to show that it's not just hollow rhetoric. I mean, when Israel says that Iran cannot threaten Israel from Syria, that it must not entrench there, that Israel is watching, and that when Iranian forces, Iranian proxies, are staging drones or rockets, especially very close to Israel's ceasefire lines, then they may face some sort of action from Israel. And I think that's clear, and Israel has been doing that over the last several years.
Right, and this is, staying with you, Seth, I mean, this is clearly Mr. Security trying to burnish his credentials. Of course, he's got an election in just a few weeks in September. How does this play with the Israeli public? Do they feel that this increased robustness, if you like, using airstrikes, makes them safer?
I don't think this is playing in deeply to the elections. I mean, Israel has admitted that it carried out more than 1,000 airstrikes in the last several years. So I think that, you know, Netanyahu is well known in Israel over the last 10 years. He's managed the conflict very well, I think, from most people's perspective. Most Israelis know him. If they object to certain aspects of Netanyahu's rule, it certainly is not usually the security issue. So I think he's trusted, and I think especially his kind of size on the world stage in terms of working with the Russians and others like the United States is something that most Israelis feel comfortable or a certain percentage in terms of the security aspect. And also most of the Israeli political parties agree on the security aspect. They all agree, basically, that Iran is a threat to Israel.
All right, coming to Tehran and Mohammed Marandi. Mohammed, the central allegation by Benjamin Netanyahu is that at least some of these strikes were preemptive in nature, in that they were to thwart what he says was a planned attack by either Iran or its allies on occupied Golan Heights using drones armed with missiles.
Well, I think it's universally recognized that Netanyahu is a very dishonest politician, even though many politicians are dishonest, but he is exceptional among them. This whole claim that Netanyahu constantly makes about attacking Iranian positions is nonsense. If there have been no Iranian soldiers killed in Syria in the recent strike or any time in the past couple of years, there was only one occasion, well, two occasions, but one occasion where recently, like a couple of years ago, they struck an air base where 7 Iranians were killed, were murdered by the Israelis. And another instance which was before that, but I won't get into that. But the point is that you cannot hide in Iran people's deaths because their friends and family will immediately put them on the internet, their pictures, just like the 2 Lebanese Hezbollah members who were murdered the other night. Their pictures came out immediately. There's nothing to hide. So when the Israelis claim that they're constantly attacking Iranian positions, that's nonsense. If they have evidence, give the names of the people who were killed, pictures of the Iranian soldiers. It's not something very difficult to access. But and the reason why they do this is because the Israelis constantly strike Syrian government positions, but they want to find some sort of justification for these illegal acts, these violations of Syrian sovereignty. And the Israelis are upset. They've been supporting ISIS and al-Qaeda on their border. We know from the interview given on your own TV network by the former head of Mossad, the relationship that existed with al-Qaeda on the Syrian border. We know what the Israelis were doing.
Right.
Every time the Syrian government was pushing back on these groups, on the Golan Heights, the Israelis would attack Syrian government positions.
Right, OK.
So, but what we now see is an escalation where...
All right, Mohammed, let's leave it there and take that to Sami, because we've got 2 competing narratives, haven't we, essentially, as ever, in the region. But one thing that I think most people will be able to agree upon, and that is that tension has now ratcheted up significantly. There are fears of a wider conflict. How far would you say are those fears justified?
I think, first of all, we have to remember that every time there is an Israeli election coming up, there is always an uptick in violence, whether that's blasting the Palestinians with ever fiercer airstrikes, or whether it is blasting another common threat. Netanyahu survives because he tells the Israelis that there is a common threat. And he's not too far from the truth. This is the language of the occupier at the end of the day, that we took people's land and they will want it back, so we have to make sure that we stick together in order to push them away. However, the Iranians are a threat. What I think is, this is not new. This is not the beginning. This is the beginning. This is part of the war that is ongoing under the covers while Trump and the Iranians have this staring match over who blinks first over the sanctions. Because the reason Trump doesn't want to go to war with the Iranians is because he's aware that the Iranians have proxies in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon and Yemen.
Sami,
and he's aware that if he goes to...
Let me interrupt you and ask you then, do you believe that what we're witnessing then is a manifestation of the bigger conflict, if you like, and that potentially between the United States and Iran, with the White House offering almost complete support for Benjamin Netanyahu and his campaign for re-election?
We heard Pompeo's statement. He supported the airstrikes. I do believe this is part of the bigger picture. The UAE and the Israelis met not too long ago, I think last week, where they were discussing. It's well known that the UAE and the Saudis are very worried that Trump is now hesitating to go to war with Iran. And the reason he is hesitating is because the Iranians have power cards. The Iranians have militias in Iraq, they have militias in Syria, they have militias in Lebanon, all who are ready to fight for the sake of the Iranian cause. For the Israelis and the UAE to convince Trump to go to war with the Iranians, they need to weaken these particular proxies. And this is why I believe that Israelis bombing these particular targets is a bid in which to try to weaken those Iranian proxies and give Trump that appetite to war that he is actually losing. Because the Israelis see Iran as a threat, as do the UAE, as do the Saudis. By the way, I'm not talking the moral perspective. I'm not saying one is right, one is wrong. We're talking about an occupier on one side and a sectarian nationalist agenda on the other side. The UAE and Saudi and Israel believe that Iran is one of the biggest threats. And Iran has outplayed the Americans in Iraq and outplayed the Americans in the other areas and the like. So Israel, with the election coming up, with Netanyahu suffering with political damage domestically, corruption allegations and the like, he wants to unite Israel as a common threat, and the UAE wants to convince Trump to go to war with Iran, and they've decided to do that by targeting Iran.
All right, Mohammed, coming back to you, central to everybody who opposes Iran at the moment, central to their accusations against Tehran is the desire to spread the revolution, which was clearly stated in 1979, and furthermore, King Abdullah's statement that the Iranian government is seeking to establish what he called a crescent of Shia influence throughout the Middle East. I mean, isn't that the core problem, which is why Tehran is facing so many issues confronting its neighbours and, of course, the United States?
No, I think that's the narrative that they'd like to create. After all, the central cause in our region is the Palestinian issue. Palestinians are almost universally Sunni, and the Iranians have been opposed to apartheid in Palestine since before the revolution. So it's not sectarian. Or, for example, in the case of Bosnia, when the Bosnians were being massacred and decimated, the only country that really went to the aid of the Bosnians and helped and saved the country were the Iranians, and Bosnia was a Sunni country. Or when ISIS attacked Erbil, the Kurdish part of Iraq, even though Iran was not happy with Mr. Barzani, but Iran immediately sent troops in to protect the city and prevent it from falling. It was about to fall. They're Sunni, they're Kurdish. So I think that this is a narrative that the Saudis, the Israelis, the Americans have a vested interest in promoting. The reason why Iran is powerful is not because it has proxies across the region, but because it has allies across the region. Whether in Iraq or Syria, these are not mercenaries, or in Lebanon or Yemen or elsewhere, these are not mercenaries. These are people who are treated as Iran's allies. Whereas what the United States and the Saudis do is they give checks, they give out money to their people. They don't support any popular causes. They support Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, which are both on the decline, and both have failed in Yemen and are declining regimes, in my opinion. So the United States, the problem that the United States has is that it is defending Israel to the hilt, and Netanyahu, like Trump, is the worst possible face of the Israeli regime, because he is so explicitly racist that even mainstream Democratic candidates in the United States have called him racist.
Okay,
this
all
is
right.
quite extraordinary for the United States.
Let's go to Tel Aviv now. And Seth, is it your understanding then that Benjamin Netanyahu, A, would like a direct conflict with Iran, or B, does he understand the riskiness of the gamble that he's taking insofar as tensions are now so increased? It also increases a risk of miscalculation.
I don't think that anyone in Israel wants another conflict. I mean, Israelis have lived with conflict for 70 years, and they are aware, for instance, of Hezbollah's rocket threats of more than 100,000 rockets that Hezbollah says can reach all of Israel. I don't think that Iran wants a conflict, and Americans don't want a conflict either. The region has been through many years of vicious conflict against ISIS and the genocide it carried out. So no one really wants a conflict, but I think that, you know, Israel has its national security interests, and it has said that it doesn't want ballistic missiles being transferred to Hezbollah, or precision guidance, or drones. I think Israel has been quite clear on that. So I don't think Israel, if you look at Netanyahu's record since he came to power, in fact, there have not been large numbers of conflict. And the main interest of the government of Israel is to protect its stability so that the country is economically successful.
Right. Sami, we've heard from the leader of Hezbollah following the two drones that are claimed to have come from Israel, that there will be retaliation. Hassan Nasrallah claimed that the ceasefire arrangement set out in the UN Security Council resolution that actually put an end to the 2006 conflict is now being broken. He said that this cannot be tolerated again. Do you expect Hezbollah, at least, to mount some sort of a retaliation that could take the region closer to all-out conflict?
I think Seth is right when he says that nobody actually wants conflict in the region. The reason being is this. At the end of the day, Israelis don't want to fight with their own forces against the Iranians. Like I said earlier, I think this is part of trying to get Trump to do the fighting instead. Trump doesn't want to do the fighting. Saudi doesn't want to do the fighting. UAE doesn't want to do the fighting. The Iranians are happy. They're expanding. All of this chaos and the like helps them to continue expanding. Once upon a time, they were only within their borders. Then in 1980s, they had the war with Saddam. And since then, they've been pushing forward, backing groups with their cultural offices and the like in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon and Yemen. In other words, the status quo suits them. They don't want to go to war either. So no party actually wants to go to war, or rather no party wants to use their own troops to go to war. Everybody wants to convince the US to do the fighting, and Trump's policy is clear. The US troops will not do the fighting. So I don't think Lebanon or Hezbollah will necessarily retaliate. I think they will allow Netanyahu to use the rhetoric. Hassan Nasrallah will use the rhetoric, all to boost their own particular support. But it's important to understand something here. We should not talk about Israel or indeed the Iranian agendas in the region as if they are legitimate agendas. When Israel is talking about preserving its security, it's doing so at the expense of an entire population. This is not Israel innocently sitting by and saying, you know what, guys, we came here very nicely, we're living and we all want to be friends, and therefore, why is everybody bombing us? Israel took an entire population's land. Hang on, just this less than a minute.
Right.
Israel took a population land and is trying to defend it. This is the reality of what's taking place. It's defending an illegitimate occupation, and this is why it is always under threat.
Right. Mohammed, now we are in a situation where we know that Iran is struggling. It's struggling. It's under this campaign of maximum pressure where it is being starved of any access to revenue. Iran really can't even contemplate, can it, entering into another costly kind of conflict? Wouldn't it be advisable, therefore, for the Iranian authorities to perhaps dial down, to perhaps withdraw, to perhaps ask its allies and its proxies to be a little bit quiet right now, given the harsh reality on the ground?
Well, the harsh reality on the ground is that the Saudis and the Emiratis, with American support, are carrying out genocide in Yemen. The harsh reality is the Israeli regime is bombing Iraqis, they're bombing the Syrians, and they've attempted an assassination yesterday in Lebanon. So it's not as if things are quiet. It's the Israeli regime that is carrying out aggression. And the reason why so many people in this region see Iran as a friend is because they see no one else supporting their cause, like the Palestinians in Gaza, like the people in Yemen, in Lebanon. And in the case of Iraq, when we see that thousands of American troops are in the country, yet they allow drones to strike Iraqi forces that fought ISIS, then obviously the sentiment in Iraq is going to turn further against the United States. Western think tanks and Western media constantly portray the United States and Israel as a protagonist in this story, and they somehow think that the rest of the world automatically assumes the same, whereas people who are on the ground see things as the exact opposite. So as long as the Israeli regime carries out strikes, then it has to expect a response. And I believe that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah will definitely retaliate against the Israelis because he said he will do so. The only thing that prevents the regime in Israel from aggression is the fear of retaliation. If the Israeli regime concludes that they can strike with impunity, then they will do so. But I think that it's very important to keep in mind what your previous said correctly, and that is that the United States does not want to war. Iran doesn't want to war. Iran, of course, has seen the failure of the maximum pressure campaign, despite the hardship that the Americans have been trying to impose on ordinary Iranians, and they have made life difficult for women and children. And I think the Americans are probably proud of their actions like they are in Libya and Syria and Yemen and Venezuela and everywhere else, Iraq and Afghanistan, where they've created so much devastation. But in the case of Iran, it's failed. The currency has stabilized.
Right.
It's actually strengthened in the past few months. The economy has leveled out.
All right.
So the Americans have failed, and that's why they began the new campaign try to begin taking tankers. But the Iranians do not want to initiate conflict. The Americans know that the Iranians do not want to do so, but the Iranians will not allow the Americans to carry out an attack on the country without facing the consequences,
All right,
and that's why Trump won't do so.
All right.
But if the Israelis want to learn the hard way, they will.
Seth, coming back to you then, what we've heard is that all players to this potential conflict are unwilling to enter into a conflict. Nobody really wants a fight. But I can't help but think that this is an exceedingly risky policy to pursue on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu. As I said earlier, the risk of there being miscalculation, Mohammed is of the impression that Hezbollah will indeed retaliate. Is this something that the Israeli public, before they get ready to vote, because I understand that Netanyahu is running neck and neck in this particular race as well, is this something that is going to secure him the votes that he needs to have a significant victory in the election?
I don't think it relates to the election, because I think that the main competitor against Netanyahu, the former chief of staff, Benny Gantz, and his generals all share the same consensus in terms of Israel's national security, and all of them are aware. Some of them probably fought against groups like Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad or these groups that are supported by Iran. They know exactly what the threat is. And look, last year, for instance, in February and May, there was an Iranian drone flown from Syria into Israeli airspace. There was rockets fired near the Golan. So this isn't a question of retaliation. This is an ongoing kind of simmering conflict. And you're right. And there could be, for instance, a miscalculation by one side or another that could spiral out of control. And hopefully that will not happen. And certainly Iran hopefully will understand the message in terms of its allies, in terms of taking Israel seriously.
All right. I'm going to give the final word to you, Sammy, if you can be really brief, please, because we are running out of time. But give us just what you think is the significance of the fact that these weapons depots in Iraq have now been targeted, and many saying that these have been struck by Israeli airstrikes.
I don't think it affects Iran's capabilities much. Iran doesn't just rely on the fact... I mean, Mohammed made a very valid point when he says that Iran governs by ideology. Hassan Nasrallah believes in Iran's ideology. Hadi al-Amiri believes in Iran's ideology. It's not like checks coming out of Riyadh, they give it to Islah or whoever, and then they betray them later on. And this is the issue here. Iran promotes the grassroots movements. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but this is the reason that they have been able to dominate. This is why the Americans launched the Hearts and Minds, because they realized that no matter how much they batter the Shia populations in Iraq or indeed in Syria or the like, it just seemed to make Iran stronger, because Iran seemed to be that resistance in the face of American aggression. The reality is you have two very competing agendas in the region. Israel and Iran, both are detrimental to the region, and both are now trying to fight each other under a simmering conflict without it going into an all-out war. None of them want an all-out war. Everybody wants the US to do the fighting, but the US is refusing to do the fighting. And this is why we have skirmishes.
All right. Sami Hamdi in London, thank you very much indeed. Mohammed Marandi in Tehran, thank you. And Seth Frantzman in Tel Aviv, thank you all very much indeed. And as ever, thank you for watching the show. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. Should you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And there's always the Twitter sphere. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. From me and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.